Hello and welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK. And thank you for joining me and Father Joseph Simmons, SJ from Campion Hall in Oxford, who is my co-convener for this series. This is the 11th event in the second year of our Christian Literary Imagination series. It is a series that's developed with Georgetown University's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Today, we're going to be joined by Dr. Rachel Cresswell, who will be discussing St. Anselm. Father Joe will formally introduce her in a moment, but let me say that she is one of the postdoctoral fellows at Blackfriars, as well as being a tutor elsewhere now in Oxford. And she is one who is energizing, if I may say so, the mission of Blackfriars Hall. It's an absolute pleasure to work with her as a colleague, and I'm delighted that she agreed to speak today. After her talk, she will take questions submitted from members of our internationally based audience. We encourage you to participate, please, by typing your questions directly to us from the moment we begin the session. And you can do this by using your Q&A key at the bottom of your screen. If you have a question or questions, please ask them and we will endeavour to answer them either today or later by email. Please use your Q&A button and not your chat button. Thank you. With that, I'll hand over to Father Joe and then to Rachel. Father Joe.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you all for joining us again. Here in Oxford, we are beginning just yesterday the Trinity term, the final term of the year, and we are very happy to be leading off with Dr. Rachel Cresswell, who's a departmental lecturer in ecclesiastical history at the Faculty of Theology and Religion here, and a senior member of Christ Church, Oxford. As Michael pointed out, she also holds a junior research fellowship at Blackfriars in Oxford. She specializes in the history of Christianity in the medieval Latin West, focusing particularly on the reception of the Bible in 11th and 12th century monastic authors. Her doctoral project, now being prepared for publication, investigated the role of Scripture in the thought and writings of Anselm of Canterbury, who is our topic today. Her current research aims to use the scriptural and liturgical motifs in Anselm's writings as a way of re-articulating his controversial theory of atonement. And as Michael said, put your questions in the Q&A and they'll be fed to me, and then I will bring them up for our conversation at the end of her talk. So without further ado, Rachel, over to you for your paper, Enlighten the Eye of the Mind, Anselm of Canterbury at the Limits of Imagination. Welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much for this invitation. I'm really delighted to be with you today. So the title of my talk, Enlighten the Eye of My Mind, is a quotation of a quotation of a quotation. In the first instance, it's a quotation from Anselm of Canterbury, the medieval philosopher, theologian, who was active in the second half of the 11th century and into the beginning of the 12th century. So that's who I'm quoting from in the first bit of my title. It's Anselm of Canterbury. Throughout his authorial career, which spanned around 4 decades, Anselm produced groundbreaking works of theological speculation, the boldest and perhaps the most controversial of which was his Proslogion. In this rational meditation, as Anselm calls it, Anselm applies the tools of reason as he understands them to the question of God's existence in an attempt to blaze an intellectual pathway to the knowledge of a certain kind of knowledge of God. What he produces in this text, the Proslogion, is the so-called ontological argument. This is an argument which has had a very diverse afterlife in the centuries after Anselm's death. And it's considered to be the first philosophical proof for the existence of God in the Middle Ages. The reason why I'm saying all of this is that it's in this text, the Proslogion, in which we encounter Anselm's ontological argument, that we also encounter the quotation from my title. We hear Anselm beseeching God to cleanse, heal, sharpen, enlighten the eye of my mind, so that it might gaze upon you. But Anselm here is quoting an idea of St. Augustine's. For Augustine of Hippo, the mechanics of physical sight provided an apt metaphor for what it was like to go about the process of spiritual seeing. So for Augustine of Hippo, whom Anselm certainly would have whose writings Anselm certainly would have known, the mechanics of physical sight involved the eye sending out a beam of light towards an object which connects the object to the eye. And it's by a sort of focused attention on that object that the eye is able to perceive what it's seeing. And this Augustine took as being a good metaphor for spiritual sight, just as the outward sense of sight depends on a certain kind of focused attention on the object. So the inner sight, the vision of God for which the soul should seek, is dependent on the health, the attention, and the determined penetration of the inner eye, the eye of the mind. So I think when Anselm is quoting this, he's probably got Augustine in mind. But Augustine is also quoting because it's actually in the Psalms that we encounter something like the phrase, enlighten the eye of my mind. In Psalm 12, verse 4, that's in the Vulgate numbering, we hear the psalmist longing for the vision of God's face with the words, enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep in death. And the fact that the eyes in question were inner eyes and that the enlightenment in question was an interior enlightenment was something that was a staple of the commentary tradition of this particular verse. So, the eye of the mind, what does this concept have to do with the Christian literary imagination? Well, Anselm does not conceive of the imagination as a distinct faculty of human psychology. So he doesn't think of it as a discrete category in the way that perhaps we would today. But he does have a robust concept of this inner eye, the eye of the mind. And it's a concept which he brings to bear with powerful rhetorical effect in a lot of his writings. And so what I'd like to do this afternoon for us in the UK, this morning for many joining us from the States, is to speak first to the imagination part of the Christian literary imagination, and then maybe to the literary part. So firstly, I'd like to look at what Anselm says about the imagination, where he uses the term, where he uses this phrase, the eye of the mind, or the eye of the soul in his writings. And then I'd like to investigate how he puts that concept into effect, how he brings that to bear in his theological writings. In his most famous rational meditation, that proslogion that I mentioned at the start, and also in one of the prayers from his collection of prayers and meditations. So that's the layout for the next half hour or so. But before I do that, perhaps it's worth introducing Anselm a little bit more. So Anselm of Canterbury is remembered variously as a philosopher, as a monastic theologian, as a rationalist and also a mystic, as a very successful Archbishop of Canterbury, and as a very unsuccessful Archbishop of Canterbury. So he's got something of a contested legacy. He was born in 1033 in the Alpine town of Aosta, now in modern day Italy. And as a young man, he traveled up to Normandy to get himself an education in the liberal arts, the arts of dialectic, logic, rhetoric, and grammar, before joining the monastery of Bec in Normandy in the Diocese of Rouen. And it's there in the monastery of Bec as a Benedictine monk that he began to write. He began to write teaching texts for his monks, a collection of devotional texts, prayers and meditations, and also works of philosophical theology like this proslogion with its alleged proof for the existence of God. He didn't stop writing when in 1093 he became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and right up until his death in 1109, on his deathbed, his main regret was that he didn't have a chance to write the book about the soul that he really wanted to get to, and he wasn't sure whether anyone else would do a good job of it. And this period, the so-called long 12th century, the period which Anselm's life nudges itself into, is generally thought to be a period of a new intellectual dynamism in the Latin West. And Anselm is largely credited for having anticipated this so-called Renaissance of the 12th century in many respects. This proof for the existence of God constituted a daring application of logic and dialectic to fundamental questions of Christian theology. And his collection of prayers and meditations as well are thought by some to have inaugurated, or at least popularized, a new style of devotion as well, an affective style, personal, emotive, highly rhetorical. But along with all of that, Anselm was also somebody who was deeply interested in the psychological and spiritual makeup of human beings, topics which may very well now fall under the category of imagination. He had an abiding fascination with what perhaps we would now call cognition, the processes of thought. And like Augustine, his writings are populated with attempts to map out the structure of thought and the coordinates of theological epistemology. How do we know? What can we know? In several places as well, he tries to dissect the anatomy of the soul. He looks at what he thinks the soul is and divides it into what he thinks its main parts are. So in several places, it's a division into three: the Augustinian tripartite division of memory, understanding, and love. And in other places, it's a division into intellect, reason, will, and appetite, things like that. Now, nowhere does he identify imagination as one of these parts of the soul, but he does use the word. And it's to those instances, to a handful of those instances where he uses the word imagination and also the phrase, the eye of the mind, that will turn now. So what the imagination for Anselm then? The capacity of the mind to receive, interpret, store, and categorize images was central to the kind of theory of thought, theory of cognition, and of knowledge that Anselm would have inherited largely from Augustine. Put very simply, it would mean something like this: fashioning mental images, the capacity of the mind to fashion mental images, was one of the things that the mind did best, and it was essential to the process of knowing things about the world. In the case of things perceptible to the senses, the five senses will gather data about the world and will relay it to the intellect. And it's the job of reason to sort and order and categorize this data into genus and species and properties and things, in order to determine what exactly is being perceived, the nature of the thing being perceived. So the faculty of reason is there to identify the form of the thing. How do you know what something is? If you're seeing something, how do you know what it is? In this Augustinian framework, you want to find out what the form is. And the form is stored in the memory as an internal image. Now, this image corresponds not only to the Platonic form of that thing, of which the mind has a certain innate knowledge facilitated by divine illumination, but the image in the mind also corresponds to the image of that thing in God's own mind. And this all sounds very positive in a way. The image producing capacities of the mind mirror in some respects the images in God's own mind, the divine ideas in God's mind. But this capacity for image creation was not without its ambivalence. The fact that the mind can distinguish between the essence of a thing and its properties meant that it could also conjure a mental image of things which don't exist. So to use an example that medieval philosophers did in fact use, if I can imagine a mountain and I can imagine goldenness, then I can put those things together and imagine a golden mountain, picture it in my mind, even though I've never actually seen such a thing. I can jumble up the images and confuse and combine their properties to create images of things in my mind that my senses have never experienced and which God has in fact not created, and perhaps for good reason. So the image producing capacities of the mind, however positive they could be, could also be dangerous. The imagination, if we can call it this, has great power to mislead and even to deceive. So there's this ambiguity there in Anselm's sort of theological inheritance, and this ambiguity is reflected in the way Anselm uses the words imagination and to imagine. In some places, the capacity to imagine likens human beings to God, particularly to God's creative activity. In the Monologion, which is one of the other rational meditations that Anselm writes, the one that immediately precedes the Proslogion, Anselm asks the question of how it is that God creates the universe from nothing, creates the universe ex nihilo. He says that although it's true in some senses to say that there was nothing prior to the creation of the world, in other senses, God had in God's own mind patterns or blueprints on images of what he was going to create, and that they pre-existed creation. And to illustrate this, Anselm uses the analogy of an artist who holds a mental image of their artwork in their mind before they go on to put it onto canvas. He describes the artist, quote, viewing mentally with the acute gaze of thought the things themselves which are going to exist, unquote. Now, of course, one big difference between the divine creator and a human artist is that God can imagine things which are entirely new, whereas a human artist and a human mind can only sort of reconfigure and copy things which already exist. So artists can imagine a golden mountain, but a human artist can't imagine a whole new color or a whole new substance, whereas God can. Yet, although, quote, a craftsman cannot at all conceive in his mind by imagining any material object except one which in some way he's already experienced, unquote, the fact that the artist does imagine things and creates them accordingly mirrors, however imperfectly, something of God's own creative mind. But elsewhere, this mind, that the capacity of the mind for creating images is for Anselm also potentially dangerous. It has the potential to obscure theological meaning. And one example of this can be found in Anselm's criticism of his fellow philosopher and contemporary, a chap called Roscelin of Compiègne. Now, Anselm, whilst using dialectical methods in his theology himself, did also sometimes deliberately distance himself from other of his contemporaries who were doing the same thing, but with more radical consequences. And one of these people was Roscelin of Compiègne. So Roscelin was a nominalist. He did not believe, as Anselm did, in the extramental reality of the Platonic forms. And at the end of the 11th century, this was a very radical departure from traditional Platonic epistemology. And as far as Anselm was concerned, it was very concerning. He thought that a person who doesn't believe in the reality of the forms just can't see past the end of their own nose. And the problem with nominalists like Roscelin for Anselm was a problem of the imagination. Their problem was that there was an uncritical overload of images in their imagination. Their minds were so stuffed with mental images of material things that they'd come to believe that material things were all that there were, that nothing else existed. Quote, in the souls of these dialecticians, reason, which ought to be the ruler and judge of all that's in a person, is covered over by corporeal imaginations, that is so covered over by corporeal imaginations that it cannot extricate itself from them, unquote. Roscelin for Anselm is, quote, one of those modern dialecticians who believe that nothing exists except what they can imagine, literally what they can understand by imaginations, unquote. So this is the problem that Rosalind has as far as Anselm is concerned. It's that, confused by the multiplicity of the images in his mind, Rosalind doesn't seem to realize that there are realities that he cannot see, that there are immaterial realities that they point towards. Rosalind doesn't have an uncluttered intellect, undarkened by a multiplicity of phantasmata, unquote. So we can see that the image-producing capacity of the mind, and perhaps we can call it the imagination for Anselm, is not always the ally of theological knowledge, by no means. Sometimes it can be the very thing that gets in the way. So there's this ambiguity here, and that is also in evidence when Anselm uses the phrase the eye of the mind or the eye of the soul. We have a large collection of surviving letters from Anselm, and we see this phrase appearing most frequently in his letters to monks and nuns. Here are a few examples. He urges a monk called William not to be held back by the snares of the world, but, quote, diligently turn the eyes of your mind away so that they see no vanity, and by constant effort keep them fixed on the truth, unquote. To another monk, Helenand, he warns that the devil will recall to his mind's eye all the luxuries that he gave up when he entered the monastery, and recall how difficult it will be to survive without them. To the Lady Basilia, who's one of the women who lives in a sort of semi-monastic life on the outskirts of the Abbey of Bec, he writes, quote, let there always be before the eyes of your mind the fact that this life has an end, and that no one knows when the last day will come, unquote. So clearly there are some images which Christians ought to retain under the spotlight of their imagination, ought to keep the eyes of their mind fixed on, and some images which they ought to divert them away from. The mind's image-producing capacity, then, is an essential aspect of the human mechanics of knowing, and a powerful participation in the creative artistry of the creator. But it's also a potential snare, cluttering the mind with material images so as to obscure contemplation of the immaterial, or crowding it with distractions and temptations, perhaps even from the devil himself. So what does Anselm do with this ambiguity then, when it comes to his writings, when it comes to tackling the theological questions he wants to tackle? And where does the imagination, the eye of the mind, come in his attempts to blaze a rational trail to the knowledge of God? Well, for this, we need to look a bit more closely at the Proslogion, which I mentioned earlier. Anselm wrote the Proslogion between 1077 and 1078, when he was prior of the monastery of Bec and just about to be elected abbot. And the text is a prayer. It takes the form of a prayer written in, quote, in the persona of someone trying to raise his mind to the contemplation of God and seeking to understand what he believes, unquote. So what's he trying to do in this prayer? Well, he tells us, he's trying to find, quote, one argument whose proof would need nothing outside of itself and which would alone suffice to demonstrate that God truly is, Deus vere est, and that he's the supreme good, and whatever else we believe about the supreme being, unquote. So this prayer that he sets out to pray, this rational meditation, what he wants to do is find one argument which alone in itself will suffice to demonstrate that God truly is, and also the other attributes that Christians attribute to God. So how does he set about doing this? I'm just going to summarize very briefly what the Proslogion says. He starts off by lamenting humanity's blindness in losing the vision of God that Adam had in the Garden of Eden, and by asking God to enlighten him as a meditator and lead him forward on his intellectual quest. And then in chapter 2, he introduces an important character in this meditation, and it's the character of the fool, This is a fool who appears in the Psalms, Psalms 13 and 52 in the Vulgate numbering. And the reference goes like this: the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Anselm brings in this fool into his meditation, and he uses it and the fool's statement that there is no God in order to introduce his central claim. It goes like this: we believe you, God, to be something than which nothing greater can be thought. Or is there no such nature as you, God? For the fool has said in his heart that there is no God, unquote. Anselm then goes on to demonstrate that it's impossible to think of that than which nothing greater can be thought, not existing in reality. So I've put together some quotations here that I'll read out to you. I hope this spells out what the argument is. It goes like this: we believe you to be something than which nothing greater can be thought. But surely, when this fool hears my words, something than which nothing greater can be thought, he understands what he hears. And what he understands is in his understanding. But surely, that than which nothing greater can be thought cannot be only in the understanding. For if it were only in the understanding, it could be thought to exist also in reality, which is something greater. Hence, without doubt, something than which a greater cannot be thought exists both in the understanding and in reality. If it really is that than which nothing greater can be thought, it can't only exist in the in the mind. It needs, because then you could imagine something greater, and then it wouldn't be that than which nothing greater can be thought. Anselm's argument is that when you think of God as that than which nothing greater can be thought, it is impossible to imagine God not existing in reality. So this is the one argument, really, that Anselm sets out to find. And he uses this formula to go on to list all of the attributes of God which have to result from it. So he asks himself, is God omnipotent? Well, it's greater to be omnipotent than not to be omnipotent. And so that than which nothing greater can be thought must be omnipotent. Is God merciful? Well, it's greater to be merciful than not to be merciful. So that than which nothing greater can be thought must be merciful. And the proslogion continues like this until Anselm stops in the middle of it, and he asks himself whether he has actually achieved what he set out to achieve, whether he's achieved the vision of God that he wanted to find at the beginning. But he has to admit that despite his discoveries, he still cannot apprehend God. His mind and his senses remain numbed to God's presence. He says this: my soul strains to see more, but sees nothing beyond what it has seen apart from darkness. Or rather, it does not see darkness, for there is no darkness in you, God. But it sees nothing beyond what it is possible to see as a result of its own darkness, unquote. It's only by contemplation of lesser goods, which participate in the supreme good, that Anselm can, at the end of the proslogion, sketch out hope for a future vision of God in the eschaton, and that's how the proslogion ends. So that's very briefly what the meditation looks like. Where's the imagination there? Well, I think in many ways, this proslogion argument, this formula, that the concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought, encapsulates precisely the tension between what it is possible to imagine and what it is not possible to imagine. Anselm's argument hinges on the claim that God is that than which nothing greater can be thought. That when he says that than which nothing greater can be thought, the fool knows what he means. He knows what he's talking about. And that he has, even the fool has, some sort of concept of that than which nothing greater can be thought in his mind. He has a verbal image of that in his mind. And yet, by definition, that than which nothing greater can be thought is beyond thought itself. Indeed, Anselm himself says that that than which nothing greater can be thought is beyond thought. You can't actually imagine it. That's the point. So it's by imagining the concept, this verbal image of that than which nothing greater can be thought, that Anselm is able to see with a searing kind of clarity that he cannot in fact imagine that than which nothing greater can be thought. It is beyond the vanishing point of what his mind can reach to, what his imagination can reach. And it's this realization that brings Anselm to the point where he recognizes that he is still numbed to the reality of God. And it's by the light of this formula that he's discovered that he's able to see how little he can see. He says, "Why is this, O Lord? Why can I only see darkness?" He says this, "Is the eye of the soul darkened as a result of its own weakness, or is it dazzled by your brilliance? Surely the soul's eye is both darkened within itself and dazzled by you," unquote. So what Anselm's appeal to the imagination achieves in the Proslogion then is to articulate the paradox that at the very heart of the apprehension of God is a non-apprehension, and at the heart of that non-apprehension is the apprehension. Anselm's formula creates a verbal image, like a logical icon, of what is meant by God. And yet it is this very verbal image which encapsulates the incapacity of the mind to picture God or to hold God in the imagination. Imaginatively picturing the limits of the imagination is what can open a person up to the reality that God is greater than imagination itself. And we see this dynamic at work not only in this philosophical text of Anselm's, but also in one of his prayers. And it's to this that I want to turn in just the final minute, because I think it's in this prayer that we can see the imagination being put to literary effect, if I can put it like that. So this is Anselm's prayer to Christ, which he writes maybe something like 20 years after the Proslogion. And here Anselm addresses Jesus in the persona of a sinful penitent, longing for forgiveness and lamenting his alienation from God. And as Anselm prays in this prayer, his rhetoric vividly conjures the scenes of the crucifixion, the burial of Jesus, the resurrection, and the ascension. But he does this, most strikingly for our purposes, by describing his own absence from those scenes. And I'll quote at length here. "Alas for me that I was not able to see the Lord of angels humbled to converse with men. Why, O my soul, were you not there to be pierced by a sword of bitter sorrow when you could not bear the piercing of the side of your Saviour with a lance? Why could you not bear to see the nails violate the hands and feet of your Creator? Why did you not see with horror the blood that poured out from the side of your Redeemer? Why were you not drunk with bitter tears when they gave him bitter gall to drink?" Unquote. Anselm evokes Jesus' ascension most luminously by contemplating how he did not, and in fact cannot, contemplate it. He says, "You have ascended, consoler of my life, and you have not said farewell to me. Going up on your way, you blessed your own, but I did not say goodbye. Lifting your hands, you were received by a cloud into heaven, and I did not see it. Angels promised your return, I did not hear it." Unquote. The power of Anselm's prayer to Christ, perhaps I might say the rhetorical, the literary power of Anselm's prayer to Christ, lies in the heartbreaking rhetorical force with which he brings before the eye of the mind the fact of its not seeing. I don't think it's because Anselm wants to present us with the wholesale failure of the imagination here. Actually, I think for Anselm, the faculty of the imagination kicks in most effectively at the very point when the human mind reaches its limit. Like in the Proslogion, the point at which his imagination fails, the point of trying to think the unthinkable, is the point which tips him into a different kind of sight, his apprehension of the distance of himself from the sight of God, which paradoxically proves that his vision is clear. It's here then that the ambiguity of the imagination's image-creating capacity, this ambiguity, the power and the limits of the eye of the mind, is conscripted into the service of Christian theological knowing. It's the very force of the theological imagination, the power to conjure images, material and verbal, that enables Anselm to delineate the limits of that imagination and thus reflect something true about human contingency in coming to know a God who dwells in unapproachable light. Thank you very much for your attention, and apologies for a couple of minutes over.
Not a problem. Thank you very much, Dr. Cresswell, for a very clear covering of a rather difficult thinker, or at least difficult to articulate that than which nothing greater can be conceived is not always an easy idea to communicate, especially to students. But I think you open up an interesting conversation to us about how he would understand the imagination in drawing on sources like Augustine. The discussion of sort of the productive and the dangerous uses of the imagination. You said, I think early on, the image producing capacities of the mind could also be dangerous. The imagination, if we can call it this, has great power to mislead, even to deceive. It puts me in mind of Coleridge's, in his Biographia Literaria, the distinction he makes between the productive primary and secondary imagination, the sort of imagination that we use day in and day out to think of the voice of our grandfather, or an artist to put together a new image, forming something into a new image artistically, that both of those would be different from mere fancy, sort of a contraction of fantasy. And you talked about sort of fantasy as delusional or a cluttering of the mind, which I found very interesting. Do you have any idea, I guess the question to that is, how did, in later thought, was what Anselm was saying about that, the dangers and the benefits of the imagination, do you see that being developed later on in any thinkers in the Christian tradition?
Oh, you put me on the spot now. Well, I think that when Aquinas comes along, we're still very much with Anselm in the realm of the Christian Neoplatonism, of the Augustinian way of seeing the world. So how Augustine envisages how the mind works, and the ideas in human minds and the way they relate to ideas in God's mind. I think when in the middle of the 12th century, or the later end of the 12th century and then into the 13th century, the Latin West gets an influx of new Aristotelian texts, so new thought which is being translated, coming to the West from via the Islamic world of Aristotelian texts that they hadn't had before. They then have to sort of reconfigure quite a lot of things and see whether it's possible to integrate these new concepts into the Christian, into Christian ideas and into a Christian synthesis. And this is, I think, what Aquinas wants to set out to achieve. So Aquinas will have a lot more of, I suppose he's traditionally considered to have a rather more empirical perspective on how knowledge, how the senses and how the mind and the images that the mind produces can reliably inform us about the world. And so I suppose in Aquinas's world, as it's slightly different from Anselm's, that the senses are considered rather more reliable probably than Anselm and his contemporaries would consider them. That's a bit of a, it's not a very full answer, but I hope it's a bit of an answer.
No, I think that was enjoyable. I was wondering sort of with Aquinas drawing on Aristotelian thought, because you see a very strong Platonic line or Platonist line from Augustine through to Anselm here, and I was curious to see how that trajectory. But I do think that where Aquinas comes in and sort of rehabilitates Aristotle and the particularity of extramental objects can be very helpful. But we could go down a rabbit hole with that all day. One thing I was interested in, kind of the role of the imagination and where God fits in with that. I was thinking of Augustine in his On Free Will speaks of God as sort of a divine artist, and that Christ is the ordering logos, sort of the Ars Divina, who helps sort of shape it. And so to the extent that someone is thinking or imagining for Augustine, they're participating in that Ars Divina, the art of Christ. And the greater reality then for Augustine would be in the mind of God than it would be anything that we ourselves could imagine. So there's always that greater reality, which is beyond human cognition and human imagination.
Right. And I think it's important as well that the second person of the Trinity as the Word of God, this concept of internal words, of a sort of verbal image that you can hold in your mind. I think in Anselm's Monologion, he unfolds a Trinitarian sort of reworking of Augustine's De Trinitate in terms of the memory, the intellect, and love as he reconfigures it. And I think this concept of, yes, the divine artist, Anselm actually uses the analogy of an artist and artwork quite a lot in his writings. But I think it's also important that what the mind produces is a word, and that the word and the image are both Christological and are often conflated for Anselm. So yes, there is this very positive reflection of the Trinitarian relation in the mind as it produces words and as it produces images, and that Anselm, I think, takes very much from Augustine. He's very excited by that idea, I think.
Okay, well, we have questions coming in fast and furious, so I'm going to turn to those so we don't miss anything. Sarah Thomas, I gather this is maybe a friend you know from Stanford.
Oh, how lovely.
He writes, glad to see you and happy your career is taking off. I have two questions. The first one is, to what extent are we, through the use of imagination, co-creators with the divine? And then the second one, have you explored Anselm on the imagination in relation to beauty? So are we, in using the imagination, co-creators with the divine? And what does Anselm have to say about the imagination and beauty?
And beauty. What excellent questions. And it's lovely to hear from you, Sarah. I really hope things are well with you. I remember our relationship very fondly, and I hope, yes, things are well. Are we co-creators with the divine? I think certainly in the sense that you come across this analogy of an artist painting quite frequently in Anselm's writings. I'm thinking of the Codeus Homo, where he sets out to explore the rationale behind the incarnation and atonement. And his interlocutor, Boso, is saying, what we don't want is just a bunch of images painted as if it's just on clouds. We want something that's painted on the canvas of firm truth. And so part of, I think, what Anselm is trying to do in that theological exploration is to demonstrate how the images of redemption that patristic thought bequeaths him, the images of recapitulation of the sin of the first Adam being redeemed by the second Adam, of the fruit of the first tree being redeemed by the fruit of the second tree, of the fall of the first woman being redeemed by the raising of the second woman, that these images are not just beautiful images, but we can not just painted on clouds or painted on thin air, but painted on a canvas of rational truth. And at the end of the Curious Homo, he and his interlocutor ask each other, well, what have we achieved? Is this just painting on clouds? And his interlocutor Bozo says, no, this is definitely firmly painted on a canvas of reality. So I think certainly Anselm considers, if we can take that as an analogy which he found motivating, I think we can consider that insofar as Anselm is doing theology, he is participating in the artistry of the divine artist, and that it is an artistic pursuit. He's in a way wanting to put on a canvas, represent to the human mind on the canvas of rational discourse, the beautiful images that the patristic world has bequeathed him. I suppose that's in some way touches on the second question of beauty, though I'd probably have to think a great deal more about that before I gave an intelligent answer. I think there is certainly in Anselm's writings a very strong aesthetic, particularly of the fittingness of things, of the rightness of things, the rectitude of things, and that there's a certain intellectual beauty in the way that all of those forms fit together, in the way that the whole of the architecture is constructed, and that everything fits neatly together. That is a hugely motivating concept for Anselm. And I think there must be something in terms of doing theology, how you do that in your theological endeavors, in the questions that you ask theologically. And there must be a relationship between that and the creation of the divine artist, this beauty and this fittingness of the creation of the divine artist. I'd have to come away with anything more original. I'd probably have to think a bit more about it, but that excellent question. So thank you very much.
It is good. I think of an article written by Jean-Louis Chrétien, something like how God the creator became the artist, and how man the artist became creator. So sort of this, how did we come to think of humans as co-creators with God? And how did we come to think of God as a creator? And so he charts a lot of these ideas through Augustine. I'll send it to you, Rachel.
Yes, please do.
Really, it's a fascinating read. I think sort of explaining that development of how we come to think of ourselves as co-creating with God, and how we think of God as not just creator of the universe, but sort of the artisan. So do
you remember if Anselm comes into that discussion?
I didn't see Anselm in that. So, but anyways. I'll send that along to you after our conversation. We have a good comment from Catherine Temple at Georgetown. She writes, I'm interested in the use of literary devices here as a way of engaging the imaginations and emotions of readers. Could you speak a bit more to the irony involved in an argument that engages the imagination in order to demonstrate its inadequacy?
Yeah. I think irony is a very good word for it, because I think surely that's what it is. In terms of a literary device, I suppose one has to ask, who is it being read by? Who's it written for? What does he envisage this text being used to do? Is it supposed to, is it supposed to convert unbelievers, for example, or is it supposed to be convincing to people who are doubting? There are quite a lot of different theories about what this might be. I think it's not for nothing that it's prayer, and that it's he envisages it being read by monks. I believe he sends it to sort of publishes it in the monastic environment. So he's thinking of monks writing it, thinking of monks reading it, big pardon. And I think that there has to be something more to it than, here you go, if you doubt that God exists, there's your answer. I think that there must be something in there that you're supposed to really sink deep into, and that it's there must be some way that it connects with what a monk is supposed to be doing. I think that for me, the power of it is that this, I've called it a verbal icon. I think the power of it is that it really, it encapsulates in grammar the fact that God's existence ought to be the thing that is most obvious. God's existence is the one existence that ought to be impossible to doubt, because God is the one being who is necessary. All other things, you can imagine them not existing. God's existence ought to be the only existence that you can't imagine not existing. And yet there is this strange reality that God's existence often appears the least obvious. So sort of ontologically speaking, metaphysically speaking, it is, as far as Anselm is concerned, the most obvious reality that there is. It should be the most undeniable reality that there is. And yet it seems to be a great deal more deniable than a lot of other things that other existences that could or couldn't exist. Even the existence of myself seems rather more obvious. And yet, if I'm, as far as Anselm is concerned, I could exist or not exist. I'm not necessary, I'm contingent. So I think, where does the irony come in? I think there must be something which helps a monk, a Christian, a believer in God, to try to bridge this strange, to try to sort of reconcile the strange reality that the one existence which ought to be literally undeniable is the one that is often denied, or that it seems quite possible to deny it, or our senses can encourage us to deny it. And I think what this little formula does is to encapsulate in grammar. It forces you to be unable to deny God's existence. It sort of encapsulates that undeniability in a sentence. So I think that's in a way what its function is. It must be something to sort of help when you're stuck in a situation where you can't perceive God's reality, and yet you cognitively believe that his reality, God's reality, is the most undeniable reality there is. I think it must be some sort of way of allowing yourself to see with the eyes of your mind this undeniability of God's existence in a verbal formula. Does that make sense?
It certainly does to me.
Yeah, but you're the only one who can answer.
I'll speak on behalf of everyone and saying, yes, I think that makes sense. That offers some insight, and it reminds me, you were talking earlier about the cluttering of the mind. There's a way in which the imagination can fixate on earthly material things, and there's almost like a spiritual responsibility or moral culpability that he seems to attach to that, saying, if you're cluttering your mind with all of this stuff, it's going to occlude the possibility of you kind of reasoning up to or thinking up to God. So you have a responsibility as a monk, as a Christian, as a believer, to sort of maybe push back in a way on the imagination, or recognize that it has its limits, and at a certain point, then that's where knowledge of God comes in, or you have to reach beyond what you can imagine.
Actually, that's a very helpful comment, because of course in the tradition, that the monastic tradition he would have inherited, there is this enormous emphasis on purity of heart, which is from the Desert Fathers, from people like John Cassian, who place great emphasis on the removal of distractions. So really, purity of heart, being able to free the mind and the soul from unhelpful distractions, is the thing which will allow you to focus your attention, like that beam of light coming out of the eye. Focus your attention on God, and the blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. So if you want to see God, purity of heart is the key. And if you want purity of heart, of course, yes, there is this process of trying to remove distractions. That it actually comes up quite a lot in Anselm's letters. The sort of injunction not to be distracted. We saw it, I think, from some of the quotations I included. Don't let the devil come in with his suggestions. Fix the eye of your mind on this, not that.
Yes, I think that that'll lead us to the final question, which is from Angela Preston, who's written a number of questions and is a regular contributor. She says there's a difference in the Bible between knowledge and wisdom, and maybe this is sort of, getting to the point of the fool says in his heart there is no God. So, what would Anselm have to say about kind of the difference between, say, knowledge, as humans are capable of doing it, and wisdom as biblically understood?
Oh, it's a big question. So he's sometimes considered to be quite tricky, because he is he's being very bold in what he's doing, in applying the tools of logic and dialectic to questions like the existence of God, or God's necessity, the necessity of God's existence. And he feels that to be legitimate. But as we saw with Roscelin of Compiègne, he's also very concerned when other people start doing it in ways that he doesn't think is legitimate. So he has a long letter that he writes against Roscelin, because Roscelin's trying to sort of he wants to distance himself from him and say, no, I'm not doing that. And he even says something like, the notion that we might need dialectic in order to prove the truths of the church is as silly as trying to lash down Mount Olympus with sticks and ropes. You don't need it. Mount Olympus is going to be fine. So there is a bit, it's sometimes a bit difficult to know what is legitimate and what isn't when it comes to using the tools of reason, as it were, as he saw them in asking theological questions. But what I think is clear is that he has this formula that he reintroduces of faith seeking understanding, that what he's trying to do, he says it again and again, he's not trying to understand in order to believe, but he's trying to believe in order to understand. I think I'd have to look more closely as to where he uses the different words, so scientia and sapientia. I don't think, off the top of my head, I'm not sure whether he makes this strong distinction between the two. And I don't think he makes this strong distinction between sort of human knowledge and divine and theological knowledge that we might see later in someone like Aquinas. I don't think that has actually come yet, sort of natural reason and reason, touched into by faith, by grace. But he certainly would consider it unwise to go about the business of trying to decide what to believe according to what you understand. I can see we've run out of time.
We'll have to wrap up there.
Great question, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rachel Creswell, for an invigorating theological, philosophical conversation about the imagination. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to my co-convener, Michael Scott, at his home to lead us home. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I've listened to that. Really, it's a great, thoughtful, informative, stimulating session. So, Rachel, thank you very much for that. And I can tell by the questions and the debate that's occurred, that other people have been as engaged as I have. And thank you, Joe, for conducting that Q&A session. Our next event in this series will be on Tuesday, the 10th of May, when Professor Liz Schaefer from Royal Holloway University in London will be telling us about Elizabeth Tanfield Carey and Amelia Lanier. These are two remarkable female writers of the early 17th century who've largely been ignored over the centuries by a male-orientated literary critical school. So it's something to look forward to. In particular, you know, for me, Elizabeth Tanfield Carey, she's the first published female dramatist. Yet I was taught that the first published female dramatist in English was Aphra Behn, 60, 70 years later, you know? So it's really interesting. And Liz has brought out a number of articles and now a book about Elizabeth Tanfield Carey and Amelia Lanier, something to look forward to. Another event you might like to know is the Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event in association with the Future of the Humanities Project, which will be on Monday, the 16th of May, when we will be discussing the impact of the war in Ukraine. And we have some highly respectable speakers and respected speakers there that day, including former ambassadors to the Ukraine and one of the leading authorities on laws pertaining to war. That's an event I think that everyone will want to come to and isn't to be missed. If I can give a bit of a personal plug, next Wednesday, the 4th of May, not tomorrow, but the 4th of May, at St. Hugh's College, Oxford, I'll be talking about Shakespeare's Roman plays and contemporary politics. And that's at 8 p.m. And that's a Toya lecture. That's the Oxford Italian Association lecture. So that's next Wednesday, the 4th of May, the Roman plays with me. We'd like to thank those at Georgetown University who've made this happen today, especially our administrators, Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. Our thanks as ever to Jack DeJoya, the president, and Dr. Tom Banchoff, the vice president, Global Affairs at Georgetown. At Campion Hall, Dr. Nick Austin, SJ, Master of the Hall, Joseph Simmons, my co-convener, Sarah Gray and Ying Ying, our Companion Hall administrators. At Blackfriars, Dr. Richard Finn, the director of the Las Casas Institute, Dr. John O'Connor, the regent, and Kinga Rona Gabnai, the administrator. And as ever, thanks to Maggie, my wife, Maggie Scott, for helping to administer this series. Finally, thanks to you for being part of the audience. Please join us again for some of the events. In the meantime, take care, keep safe. If you come on the 4th of May, introduce yourself to me. We're delighted to have you in the audience. I'm Mike Scott. Please follow me on Twitter at Mike Scott Prof. Thank you. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Father Joe. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye.